What happens when the most dangerous words inside an industrial facility are not shouted, but quietly written in a report no one wants to read? In the weeks before the refinery exploded and lit up the entire city, nothing looked dramatic from the outside. The stacks burned as usual. The control room screens glowed with familiar numbers. Production targets were being met. To executives, investors, and even city officials, the facility appeared stable, predictable, under control. But buried inside a routine safety assessment was a warning that should have stopped everything. The report did not come from an activist or an outsider. It came from someone who knew the refinery intimately. An engineer whose job was to notice what others missed. Someone trained to read vibrations, pressure anomalies, temperature inconsistencies, and subtle deviations that never trigger alarms until it is already too late. His findings were precise, unemotional, technical. A pattern of abnormal pressure, spikes in a critical unit, a degradation trend in aging piping, a safety margin shrinking week by week, masked by software smoothing and manual overrides. There was no dramatic language in the report, no apocalyptic predictions, just data, correlations, and a simple conclusion. Under current operating conditions, the risk of a catastrophic failure was no longer theoretical. It was escalating, and fast. That should have been enough. In a system designed to prioritize safety, any document containing those words should have triggered inspections, shutdowns, emergency reviews. Instead, the report triggered something else entirely. Laughter, dismissal, quiet irritation. Managers questioned the methodology. Executives pointed to recent audits that showed compliance. Production supervisors argued that similar readings had appeared before, without incident. Someone suggested the engineer was being overly cautious, perhaps trying to justify his role, perhaps misunderstanding the normal behavior of the system. Another hinted that raising alarms without absolute certainty could cause unnecessary panic and costly downtime. This was not an argument about facts. It was a collision between engineering reality and corporate comfort. Inside heavy industry, danger rarely arrives without warning. It arrives gradually, hiding inside normalized deviations. What made this report inconvenient was not that it was unclear, but that it demanded action. Action meant slowing production. Action meant inspections that could expose deeper problems. Action meant accountability. So the report was redirected. It was sent for further review. It was placed in a queue. It was stripped of urgency through meetings and emails and revisions. Each step diluted its impact. Each delay increased the risk. The engineer was told to wait, to gather more data, to avoid alarming language, to trust the system. And this is where the real failure began. Refineries do not explode because of a single broken component. They explode because warnings become background noise, because small deviations become accepted norms, because the people closest to the risk are trained, subtly and repeatedly, to stop pushing when resistance appears. Over time, silence becomes part of the safety culture. The engineer knew this. He had seen similar patterns earlier in his career. Minor incidents brushed aside, near misses reframed as successes. He understood that once a facility convinces itself that nothing bad has happened yet, it starts to believe nothing bad will happen at all. Past survival becomes proof for future safety. But physics does not care about confidence. Metal does not negotiate. Pressure does not wait for approval. In the days following the report, the anomalies continued. The system compensated automatically. Backup layers absorbed stress. On paper, everything still looked acceptable. In reality, the refinery was being held together by shrinking margins and human optimism. The warning had been issued the moment to intervene was passing. What no one wanted to admit was that the report was not predicting an accident in some distant future. It was describing a process already underway, a chain reaction forming quietly, step by step, beneath steel and concrete. And once that chain reached a critical point, there would be no meeting, no revision, no delayed email that could stop it. If this story already makes you uncomfortable, that is exactly the point. Industrial disasters rarely begin with explosions. They begin with warnings that are ignored. Take a moment to leave a comment below and share what you think really causes situations like this. Is it negligence, pressure for profit, or something deeper inside industrial culture? Your perspective matters here. If you want to keep understanding how these disasters truly unfold, Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next part of this investigation. In the days leading up to the explosion, the refinery did not feel like a place on the edge of catastrophe. It felt normal. That is what made it so dangerous. Operators arrived for their shifts, logged into control systems, reviewed dashboards filled with green indicators, and followed procedures they had repeated hundreds of times before. From the outside, nothing suggested that the facility was approaching a breaking point. Inside, however, the system was quietly changing its behavior. Pressure fluctuations became slightly more frequent, but still within accepted limits. Temperature readings showed minor inconsistencies that were easy to attribute to sensor drift or ambient conditions. Maintenance crews noticed unusual vibrations in certain sections of piping, but the readings never crossed the thresholds that would trigger automatic shutdowns. Each anomaly, taken alone, looked harmless. Together, they formed a pattern that only mattered if someone chose to connect the dots. This is how industrial disasters hide in plain sight. Modern refineries are built with layers of redundancy. When one component begins to degrade, another compensates. Control software smooths spikes, dampens oscillations, and presents operators with stable-looking averages rather than raw instability. The system is designed to keep running, even when parts of it are no longer healthy. That resilience is a strength, but it also creates an illusion of safety. Operators trusted the screens because the screens had always been right before. Alarms did not sound. Emergency systems did not activate. Production continued uninterrupted. Every successful hour reinforced the belief that the system could handle whatever stress it was under. Survival became evidence that nothing was wrong. Behind the scenes, however, the refinery was relying more and more on compensations that were never meant to be permanent. Valves adjusted more frequently to maintain pressure. Pumps worked harder to push material through sections where flow resistance was increasing. Safety margins quietly shrank as equipment aged faster than replacement schedules allowed. These were not reckless decisions. They were practical ones. Shutting down a refinery is not simple. It affects supply chains, contracts, city revenues, and political reputations. Each shutdown requires justification, documentation, and approval. Without a clear failure, stopping production feels excessive. And so the system learned to tolerate abnormal conditions as long as nothing visibly broke. Maintenance reports reflected this mindset. Language softened. Words like critical were replaced with monitor. Immediate attention became scheduled review. Small leaks were classified as acceptable losses. Temporary fixes became semi-permanent solutions. Every compromise made sense in isolation. Together, they created a fragile equilibrium. What made this phase especially dangerous was that experience worked against caution. Many of the people on site had lived through previous scares that never turned into disasters. They remembered warnings that led nowhere. They remembered inspections that found nothing serious. Over time, this history bred confidence. If nothing had happened before, why would it happen now? But industrial systems do not fail based on history. They fail based on physics, chemistry, and accumulated stress. By the final shift before the explosion, the refinery was operating in a state that engineers call stable instability. Everything appeared controlled, but only because the system was constantly correcting itself. It was like balancing on a moving surface that required continuous adjustment. As long as those adjustments worked, nothing seemed wrong. If they stopped working, failure would be instantaneous. No one announced an emergency that night. No sirens sounded. Workers followed routine checklists, unaware that the margin for error had nearly vanished. The system had become intolerant to surprises, but no one realized it yet. And that is the cruel irony of industrial catastrophes. The last moments before collapse often feel the safest, because the system is fighting harder than ever to appear normal. Before we move into how organizational pressure and internal culture pushed this fragile system, even what's ultimately sealed the refinery's fate was not a single faulty valve or a defective sensor, but a culture that quietly trained people to stop insisting. Inside the facility, safety was spoken about constantly, but in practice it competed with something far more powerful: continuity. Keeping the operation running had become the unspoken priority that shaped every decision, conversation, and compromise. Engineers and technicians learned early how far they could push before meeting resistance. Raising a concern once was acceptable. Raising it twice was tolerated. Raising it a third time marked you as difficult. Over time, people adjusted their behavior. They still noticed problems, still discussed them quietly among peers. But fewer of those concerns ever reached decision-makers with their original urgency intact. This was not enforced through threats or punishments. It was subtler than that. Career advancement depended on being seen as reliable, pragmatic, and solution-oriented. Reliability meant not causing delays. Pragmatism meant understanding production pressures. Being solution-oriented meant fixing problems without interrupting operations. In this environment, the safest personal choice was often silence. Meetings followed a familiar pattern. A concern would be raised, acknowledged, and then reframed. Management asked whether the issue could be monitored instead of acted upon. Someone referenced past incidents where similar conditions resolved themselves. Financial implications were mentioned, not explicitly as reasons to ignore the issue, but as context that made immediate action seem unreasonable. By the end of the discussion, urgency had evaporated. Documentation played a critical role in this process. Reports were edited for tone. Words like dangerous were replaced with suboptimal. Probabilities were softened. Worst-case scenarios were omitted to avoid appearing alarmist. Each revision made the situation sound more manageable, more distant, less deserving of immediate intervention. Over time, this created a feedback loop. Leadership received reports that appeared calm and controlled. Based on those reports, leadership concluded that the system was functioning within acceptable bounds. That conclusion reinforced expectations for future reports to follow the same restrained tone. Anyone breaking that pattern stood out immediately. The most experienced workers understood this dynamic better than anyone. They had seen colleagues burn out or stall their careers by pushing too hard. They had learned when to speak and when to step back. Ironically, the people most capable of recognizing danger were also the most cautious about escalating it. This is how high-risk environments drift into danger without realizing it, not through incompetence, but through normalization. When abnormal conditions persist without immediate consequences, they become the new normal. When people adapt successfully to risky situations, the risk itself becomes invisible. Inside the refinery, informal conversations reflected this shift. Workers joked about alarms that always cry wolf. They shared stories of previous warnings. That led nowhere. Each story reinforced the idea that systems were robust enough to handle stress indefinitely. Confidence grew not from evidence of safety, but from the absence of disaster. What made this culture especially dangerous was that it did not feel reckless. It felt responsible. People believed they were protecting jobs, stability, and the community that depended on the refinery. No one woke up intending to gamble with lives. They simply accepted small risks repeatedly, trusting that experience and redundancy would continue to protect them. But silence has a cost. Every unchallenged assumption becomes part of the system. Every unspoken concern increases the load on components already under stress. Eventually, the system stops asking for permission to fail. By the time the refinery reached this stage, it no longer required a major mistake to trigger disaster. It only required one ordinary event occurring at the wrong moment. A routine operation, a slight delay, a condition. The system could no longer absorb, and that moment was approaching faster than anyone inside the facility realized. By the time the refinery reached its most fragile state, the real danger was no longer obvious even to trained eyes. The systems designed to prevent catastrophe were still present, still reporting data, still giving the impression of control. But beneath that surface, critical components were no longer behaving the way their designers intended. The failure did not begin with something dramatic like a ruptured tank or a runaway reaction. It began with microscopic fatigue inside metal that had been exposed to heat cycles for years. Internal corrosion where chemical residues met moisture in places inspectors could not easily reach. Gaskets that had lost elasticity. Seals that no longer responded instantly. Valves that hesitated just long enough to matter. Sensors continued to report values within limits, but those limits had been defined for healthy systems. As equipment aged, the same readings carried different meanings. A pressure spike that once indicated a transient fluctuation now reflected structural weakness. A temperature variation that used to signal minor inefficiency was now evidence of uneven flow and internal obstruction. The data had not changed. The system had. One of the most dangerous aspects of modern industrial facilities is their dependence on indirect measurement. Operators do not see what is happening inside pipes and vessels. They see numbers, trends, and averages. When those numbers remain within acceptable ranges, the assumption is that the physical system remains sound. But this assumption only holds if the relationship between measurement and reality remains intact. In this refinery, that relationship had quietly degraded. Safety systems relied on layers of automation designed to intervene if conditions crossed predefined thresholds. But automation assumes clear boundaries between normal and abnormal. As margins shrank, those boundaries became meaningless. The system began operating in a narrow zone where failure could occur without ever triggering a formal alarm. Some protective mechanisms had also been modified over time. Temporary bypasses installed during maintenance were left in place longer than intended. Alarm delays were adjusted to prevent nuisance trips. Redundancies were technically present, but no longer independent, relying on shared infrastructure that introduced single points of failure. None of these changes violated regulations on their own. Each was documented, justified, and approved in isolation. But combined, they transformed a resilient design into a brittle one. The most critical weakness was invisible from the control room. A section of piping that handled volatile material had experienced repeated thermal stress beyond its original design assumptions. Expansion and contraction had altered its internal geometry. Flow turbulence increased, causing localized heating. That heating accelerated material degradation, which further disrupted flow. A self-reinforcing loop had formed. Engineers called this condition metastability. The system appears stable, but only because opposing forces cancel each other out. Remove one force, and collapse follows immediately. In this case, the system depended on precise timing, flawless sensor response, and constant operator intervention to remain intact. Any deviation could be fatal. What made the situation especially dangerous was that even experts reviewing the system from outside would have struggled to identify the threat. Standard inspections focused on compliance, not on emergent behavior. Checklists confirmed that components existed, not that they interacted safely under extreme conditions. Inside the refinery, the machinery was no longer failing gracefully, it was failing silently. By the final hours before the explosion, the system had lost its ability to recover from disruption. It could still operate, but it could no longer protect itself. The difference between routine operation and catastrophe had narrowed to seconds, and that meant the trigger did not need to be extraordinary. It only needed to be ordinary, arriving at the worst possible moment. On the night of the explosion, nothing about the refinery felt urgent. Shift change happened on schedule. Operators exchanged routine handovers, mentioning minor issues already flagged for monitoring. Nothing that required immediate escalation. Control room screens displayed stable flows, pressures hovering just below internal limits, temperatures correcting themselves through automated adjustments. To anyone walking the site, it was just another night of continuous operation. This was the most deceptive phase of all. Facilities rarely fail during moments of chaos. They fail during calm, when systems are stretched thin but appear obedient. By this point, the refinery was operating in a narrow band, where every component depended on the flawless performance of the next. No margin remained, but no warning announced that fact. Inside the control room, operators trusted what they could see. Trends looked smooth because the software was smoothing them. Sudden spikes were averaged out. Short-lived deviations were filtered before becoming alarms. The system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do: protect production continuity. Outside, maintenance crews completed routine rounds. They heard unfamiliar sounds, subtle vibrations that felt slightly different underfoot, but nothing alarming enough to justify a shutdown request. Over time, people learn which sensations demand action and which can be ignored. That night, experience told them this fell into the second category. What no one could see was how tightly coupled everything had become. A minor pressure adjustment in one unit forced compensatory flow changes elsewhere. A valve responded milliseconds slower than expected. A sensor lagged just enough to report conditions that were already outdated. Individually, these delays were meaningless. Together, they created a situation where the system was always reacting to the past, never the present. As the hours passed, operators made small decisions without realizing their cumulative impact. A manual override to stabilize output, a delayed inspection to avoid disrupting throughput, a recalibration pushed to the next shift. None of these choices felt reckless. Each one felt reasonable, even responsible. This is how disasters assemble themselves quietly. By the time midnight approached, the refinery had entered a condition engineers describe as time-dependent instability. The system could still operate, but only as long as nothing unexpected occurred. Any sudden demand, any fluctuation outside modeled behavior, would push it beyond recovery. And something unexpected did occur. A routine operational change, one performed countless times before, introduced a brief imbalance. Under normal conditions, the system would have absorbed it without consequence. That night, it could not. Stress concentrated where material had already weakened. Heat rose faster than sensors could register. Pressure surged through a pathway that no longer had the resilience it once did. In the control room, indicators hesitated. Readings lagged reality by seconds that now mattered. Operators saw values climbing but assumed the automated controls would correct them, just as they always had. The system attempted to respond, but its responses arrived out of sequence. This was the moment when the refinery stopped being forgiving. From the outside, the city still slept. Streetlights glowed, traffic moved quietly. No one beyond the facility walls had any reason to believe that, in a matter of moments, the night sky would be torn apart by fire. Inside the refinery, the chain reaction had already begun. Not with an explosion, but with a loss of coordination between systems that no longer spoke the same language at the same speed. Steel expanded where it should not have. Containment weakened where it was assumed strongest. There was still time to intervene, but only seconds. And the people best positioned to stop it were relying on signals that were already too late. The first rupture did not announce itself with a sound anyone could immediately recognize as catastrophic. It was a sharp mechanical failure, a sudden loss of containment inside a section of the refinery already operating beyond its true limits. In less than a second, pressurized material escaped into an environment never designed to hold it. Heat, vapor, and fuel met in a space where oxygen was plentiful and control was gone. What followed was not a single explosion, but a chain reaction. The initial release created a rapidly expanding cloud, invisible at first, spreading through corridors, around structures, beneath platforms. Sensors detected abnormal conditions, but the data arrived fragmented, and delayed automated systems attempted corrective actions that were no longer physically possible. Valves closed too late. Emergency shutdown logic activated after the process it was meant to stop had already escaped containment. Ignition was inevitable. When it happened, the force was staggering. A flash fire raced through the vapor cloud, faster than human reaction time. In an instant, darkness turned into daylight. The shockwave slammed into nearby units, shattering windows, deforming metal, ripping insulation from pipes. The sound rolled across the city like thunder, followed by a rising column of flame that could be seen for miles. People woke up thinking it was an earthquake, a bomb, a plane crash. Entire neighborhoods were illuminated, as if the sun had risen at midnight. Car alarms triggered simultaneously. Power flickered. Phones began ringing before emergency services could even understand what had happened. Inside the refinery, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. The initial blast compromised adjacent systems that had already been weakened by years of stress. Fire suppression systems activated, but water pressure dropped as lines were damaged. Foam systems deployed unevenly. Some areas were flooded with suppressant, while others burned unchecked. Workers ran toward emergency exits through smoke, so thick it erased all sense of direction. Training took over, but training assumes systems that respond predictably. That night, nothing behaved as expected. Pathways collapsed. Secondary explosions followed as heat reached storage units, and pressure relief systems failed under conditions they were never designed to endure. Outside the facility, the city began to feel the full impact. Debris rained down beyond the perimeter. Residents felt the heat on their faces even blocks away. Hospitals activated mass casualty protocols within minutes. Fire departments from surrounding regions were dispatched as the scale of the blaze became clear. What made this disaster uniquely devastating was its visibility. This was not a hidden industrial accident contained within factory walls. It was a spectacle of fire and force that transformed the skyline. News helicopters captured images of towering flames punching into the night sky. Social media filled with videos recorded from balconies, streets, and rooftops. each one documenting a city suddenly at war with its own infrastructure. Inside the control room, operators watched systems fail, faster than they could process the information. Screens went dark, communications dropped, backup power engaged briefly, then vanished. The facility that had run continuously for years was now tearing itself apart, and in the middle of the chaos, one truth became unavoidable. This was not an unpredictable freak event. It was the final outcome of a process that had been building quietly, deliberately, over time. The explosion was not the beginning of the disaster. It was the moment the disaster became impossible to ignore. As firefighters fought to contain the blaze and authorities struggled to understand what they were facing, a crucial question emerged almost immediately. Where, exactly, did this failure truly begin? In the aftermath of the explosion, early explanations focused on what people could see: the fireball, the collapsed structures, the destroyed units. But visible destruction is never the true starting point of an industrial disaster. To understand what actually failed, first, investigators had to rewind the sequence far earlier, to a moment when nothing looked broken at all. The first failure was not mechanical, it was informational. Long before steel ruptured and flames erupted, the system lost the ability to accurately represent its own condition. Sensors still produced data, but that data no longer reflected reality in real time. Measurements lagged behind physical changes. A pressure reading that appeared stable on a screen was already outdated by the time an operator saw it. Control decisions were being made based on a past that no longer existed. This mismatch between perception and reality was critical. The second failure was systemic. Safety mechanisms assumed independence that was no longer there. Redundant systems relied on shared utilities, shared logic, and shared assumptions. When one layer began to falter, others followed almost immediately. What looked like redundancy on paper behaved like a single fragile system in practice. The third failure was structural. A section of equipment that had endured years of thermal cycling and chemical exposure had crossed an invisible threshold. It did not need to break completely to become dangerous. It only needed to lose its tolerance for fluctuation. Once that tolerance was gone, even a routine operational change became destructive. But perhaps the most consequential failure was human, and it happened well before the night of the explosion. Decisions made months earlier had normalized abnormal conditions. Temporary workarounds had become standard practice. Alerts had been reclassified as nuisances. Over time, the organization had trained itself to interpret warning signs as noise rather than signals. By the time the final sequence began, no one was truly listening anymore. When the critical imbalance occurred, operators responded correctly, based on the information they had. The tragedy was that the information was already compromised. The system did not fail because people ignored alarms. It failed because alarms arrived too late, or never arrived at all. Investigators eventually identified the initiating event as a loss of containment in a component operating beyond its effective design limits. But that description, while technically accurate, missed the larger truth. The component failed because the system had removed every other opportunity to intervene. The explosion was simply the point where the gap between reality and belief became impossible to maintain. Understanding this sequence matters because it challenges a comforting myth that disasters are caused by single, identifiable mistakes. In reality, they emerge from layers of small decisions that feel safe until they intersect in exactly the wrong way. And once that intersection occurs, no emergency response, no heroics, and no last-minute intervention can undo it. As investigations continued and blame began to circulate, attention shifted from technical causes to consequences, not just what failed, but what the city, the environment, and the people would have to live with long after the flames were extinguished. When the flames finally began to recede, the disaster did not end, it simply changed form. The most violent phase was over, but what remained was a slow-moving crisis that would unfold over months and years, long after the cameras left and the headlines faded. Inside the refinery perimeter, emergency crews worked through smoke and debris, searching for missing workers. Some had escaped with burns and fractures, others never made it out. In the confusion of evacuation, accountability became difficult. Shift logs were incomplete, radios had failed. Families waited outside cordons, watching the glow of fire in the distance, not knowing who was alive and who was still inside. Hospitals across the city activated disaster protocols, emergency rooms filled with patients suffering from burns, smoke inhalation, and blast injuries. Doctors quickly realized this was not a typical mass casualty event. Chemical exposure, complicated treatment. Symptoms varied. Some patients collapsed hours later after initially appearing stable. Others arrived with respiratory distress that worsened rapidly as contaminants continued to circulate in the air. Beyond the immediate injuries, the environmental damage began to reveal itself. Air quality monitors registered spikes far beyond safe thresholds. Toxic compounds released during the explosion drifted over residential areas, settling invisibly on streets, rooftops, and open water. Residents were told to stay indoors, to seal windows, to turn off ventilation systems. Schools closed, businesses shut down. A city built around the refinery suddenly had to protect itself from it. Water systems became a second front of concern. Firefighting runoff, mixed with chemical residues, flowed into drainage channels, rivers, and soil. Officials assured the public that contamination was contained, but sampling told a more complicated story. Certain compounds persisted. Cleanup crews could remove visible debris, but invisible contamination proved far harder to control. For many residents, the psychological impact was just as severe. The explosion shattered a sense of safety that had existed for generations. People who had grown up seeing the refinery as a symbol of stability now saw it as a threat. Sleep became difficult. Loud noises triggered panic. The memory of the night sky, turning white, stayed with them. Workers faced a different kind of trauma. Survivors replayed decisions endlessly, wondering what they missed, what they could have said, when they should have spoken up. Some left the industry entirely. Others returned to similar facilities, carrying knowledge they wished they had never gained the hard way. Economically, the damage rippled outward. Thousands were suddenly out of work. Supply chains were disrupted. The city lost tax revenue overnight. Small businesses dependent on refinery workers struggled to survive. What had once been framed as a localized industrial accident revealed itself as a systemic shock to an entire community. Officials promised accountability. Investigations were announced. Compensation funds were discussed. But for those living with the consequences, these processes moved painfully slowly. Environmental testing continued long after public attention waned. Health studies began tracking long-term effects that might not become clear for decades, and hovering over everything was an uncomfortable realization. This was not an unavoidable natural disaster. It was a man-made event, produced by decisions, incentives, and silence. As the city tried to recover, and officials worked to control the narrative, a different story began to take shape behind closed doors. One that challenged early explanations and raised difficult questions about responsibility. In the weeks after the explosion, the story presented to the public hardened quickly. Press conferences emphasized shock, unpredictability, and tragedy. Officials described the event as a rare convergence of technical failures, an anomaly no one could reasonably have foreseen. The language was careful, controlled, and designed to reassure a shaken population that this was an exception, not a symptom. But behind that polished narrative, something else was happening. Internal documents were being reviewed, rewritten, and quietly reclassified, shifted subtly. Early drafts of incident reports mentioned warning signs and unresolved maintenance issues that later versions described as routine or unrelated. Technical language was adjusted to obscure causality, replacing direct links with vague correlations. Responsibility dissolved into abstraction. This process did not require an explicit conspiracy. It followed a familiar pattern seen in industrial disasters around the world. Legal teams advised caution. Communications departments coordinated messaging. Executives emphasized cooperation with investigators while limiting what information left the organization. Every statement was filtered through risk management. One of the first moves was to isolate the failure. A single component became the focus. A specific piece of equipment, a specific moment, a specific operator action. By narrowing the scope, the broader systemic issues faded into the background. If the disaster could be framed as a localized malfunction, it could be fixed, compensated, and forgotten. The original warning report resurfaced briefly, then disappeared from public discussion. It was labeled inconclusive. Its author was described as having raised general concerns, not a specific prediction. The laughter that had followed its submission was never mentioned. In official summaries, the report became just one of many routine safety documents, stripped of its urgency and context. Employees were instructed on how to speak to investigators. Not what to say, but how to say it. Stick to facts. Avoid speculation. Refer questions upward. These instructions were framed as protection, but they also ensured consistency. Inconsistency creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates accountability. Meanwhile, regulatory agencies faced their own pressures. Investigations moved forward, but slowly. Jurisdictional boundaries complicated oversight. Some findings were sealed pending litigation. Others were released in fragments, too technical for most people to interpret without expert guidance. Public attention began to drift. As months passed, the dominant narrative took hold. The explosion was tragic, yes, but unforeseeable. Safety systems had failed, but only because the event exceeded their design assumptions. Lessons would be learned. Improvements would be made. The system, fundamentally, was sound. Yet for those closest to the disaster, this version of events felt incomplete. Engineers recognized the language of minimization. Workers remembered conversations that never appeared in transcripts. Families of victims sensed that something was being left unsaid. The truth was not erased, it was diluted. And dilution is often enough. As legal settlements replaced public scrutiny and rebuilding plans took center stage, one final revelation emerged from independent investigators and leaked documents. A truth that reframed the entire story and forced a re-evaluation of what had really been ignored. Long after the fire was extinguished and the debris cleared, the most damaging discovery did not come from official hearings or corporate statements. It came from fragments, independent analyses, leaked internal communications, technical appendices buried deep inside regulatory filings that few people ever read. When these pieces were finally connected, they told a story far more unsettling than the official version. The original warning report was not vague, it was specific. It identified the exact unit that later failed, described the mechanism of degradation, and outlined a credible pathway to catastrophic loss of containment. The timeline in the report aligned disturbingly well with the sequence of events reconstructed after the explosion. What had been dismissed as theoretical risk turned out to be a precise forecast. Even more troubling was what happened after the report was submitted. Emails revealed internal discussions about its potential impact on production schedules. Cost estimates for preventive shutdowns circulated alongside suggestions to monitor trends instead of acting. One message referenced the risk of overreacting to worst-case modeling. Another explicitly questioned whether the findings could be reframed to avoid triggering mandatory reporting requirements. This was not ignorance. It was awareness without action. Further investigation showed that the refinery had experienced similar, smaller incidents in the past. Near misses that never reached the public. Pressure excursions that were resolved quietly. Temporary repairs that postponed deeper intervention. Each incident reinforced a dangerous belief that the system could continue absorbing stress indefinitely. The explosion shattered that belief, but only after it was too late. Independent engineers reviewing the case reached a stark conclusion. The disaster was not caused by an unforeseeable failure. It was caused by a decision to tolerate known risk. The refinery did not lack information, lacked willingness to disrupt itself. For the city, this realization changed everything. What had initially been framed as an unavoidable tragedy became evidence of preventable harm. Trust eroded. Lawsuits multiplied. Regulatory standards were rewritten, but only after lives were lost and communities damaged. The engineer who wrote the original report eventually spoke publicly, not in anger, but with exhaustion. He described watching the system fail exactly as he had feared, knowing that once the process crossed a certain threshold, no emergency response could stop it. His warning had not been ignored because it was wrong. It had been ignored because it was inconvenient. This is the pattern that repeats across industrial history. Disasters are rarely caused by missing data. They are caused by dismissed data, by organizations that confuse successful operation with safe operation, by cultures that reward continuity more than caution. And the most unsettling part is this. Nothing about this story is unique. Refineries, chemical plants, power stations, and industrial facilities around the world operate under similar pressures, with similar trade-offs and similar assumptions. The conditions that led to this explosion still exist elsewhere. Hidden behind dashboards, compliance reports, and reassuring language, the city rebuilt, the company moved on, new safeguards were installed. But the warning that mattered most had already proven itself, written plainly, laughed at, and forgotten until fire turned night into day. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, you already understand something most people never stop to think about. Industrial disasters are not sudden accidents. They are built slowly, decision by decision, warning by warning. Take a moment now and leave a comment below. Write ignored warnings if you believe this explosion could have been prevented. Your comment helps this story reach more people who need to understand how these tragedies really happen. If this investigation gave you a new perspective, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, each one exposing how small failures inside massive systems can lead to devastating consequences. And do not stop here. Click on the next video appearing on your screen to continue uncovering the hidden truth behind the world's most catastrophic industrial disasters.